thought she saw a daling in Konr. The people expected plentiful harvests. Jarl himself left the battle to give the noble leek to the young lord. They named him Konr and gave him Ringstaðir, Solfjall, Snæfjall, and Sigursgere. Ringstaðir and Hotan and Himinvandar, an ornate sword, to Svine's brother. The high-born youth grew up in joyous splendor, in care of kinsmen. He paid and gave to his huskarlar, nor spared the Jarl the blood-stained sword. Welcome to the Sacred Stew. I'm your host, James, and my co-host, Anthony, is here. And tonight we have a guest coming on. He's another local ossature in the region. It's Joe. He does a lot of community building throughout our region. And we thought we'd add him to the conversation tonight. As we mentioned in previous episodes, we want to kind of tackle different events in the history of the epic story of our Germanic lore and history. And we want to talk tonight a little bit about Konr, the son of Jarl, and him coming to be. But before we do that, I wanted to check in with everybody and see if they had anything that they wanted to mention or bring up tonight. I know Anthony is always full of thoughts, but Joe, I want to start with you because I know that you've been listening to our episodes from the very beginning. You've told me that you really like it. You think it's one of the best podcasts that's out there right now. Tell me what your thoughts are on our show.
Well, I thank you for inviting me, first of all. And yeah, I think your podcast is great. It goes beyond just like superficial lore that we've all kind of heard, and it delves more into esoteric things and the greater vision of also true and how it relates to us in this day and age. Yeah, and I'm excited to be here. So yeah, that's pretty what I think of your guys' show. I think it's great. So thank you again for inviting me.
I mean, I'm just excited to have Joe on because I have really good conversations with you one-on-one. I have some really good conversations with Joe one-on-one, and I know you guys have some great conversations amongst yourselves. So I think this will definitely be one of our more interesting ones and more in-depth ones. I'm excited.
So I know that we're kind of doing this episode impromptu, as they say. Normally, you and I record on Sundays and release late Sunday evening. But we both got the day off from work because of the weather up here in our region. And I felt like talking about something today that seems to be a recurring conversation I'm seeing in lots of different heathen chats. I wanted to talk a little bit, obviously, about Konr, but I want to go off on a tangent a bit here and talk about the identity or the way that we identify ourselves today. This conversation might be a little controversial to some, but I want to deal with the topics of like the concept of who we are as a people. I know that there's a trend over the last 150 years to sort of find definitive terminology that represents who we are as a folk in the broader sense. And one of those terms being, for example, Aryan, or another really popular term is Hyperborean, for example. What are your guys' thoughts on how we identify ourselves today?
For ages, Aryan was not a bad word. And then, of course, after World War II, it's been made an horrible thing. I think the Aryan peoples go way back, it's like all the way back to Egypt and all that good stuff. And I think we should not feel ashamed to identify as Aryan or Indo-European, was kind of like the nice name for it. And I think we've created a lot of great societies and peoples throughout the world. And yeah, that's kind of my initial thoughts about that. I think it's been made an evil thing, and it goes against the narrative we have now with this materialistic world that we are currently finding ourselves in. But I think the Aryan man, I think we need to do the right thing, and that is to live with natural law and stand up and do the right thing and not feel ashamed for it.
As far as the Hyperborean, I actually don't know much about it, so I can't speak on that. But like personally, I don't have an issue with the term Aryan being used in and of itself. However, I from personal experiences, I have met a significant amount of individuals that use that term that are absolutely less than noble. So for me, it's kind of a gray area. I personally, when I refer to all people, I kind of use like Germanic or Teutonic kind of interchangeably. Just because I also don't know that much about the Aryans. And so if somebody were to ask me why I define our peoples as that, I couldn't give an intellectual answer. So I keep it to where I have a little bit of grounding if I'm asked.
I appreciate both of those viewpoints on it. And I think it's kind of a contrast between taking modern perspective of how we or people have chosen to begin identifying who we are as a folk versus the trend of some people reaching back to the traditional way that we may have identified ourselves, and where we can find I guess a middle ground. For me, I always, being the traditionalist that I am, I always try to look at it from the perspective of my ancestors. And so I try to take a more of a traditional view of it, where I see it as an important aspect of carefully defining who we are as a people. Now, I certainly think that in the modern age, with the terminology people use, I certainly think that there is some validity to it in the sense of people are trying to have a definitive, broader identity among people as a whole. But I think what they're doing is they're taking terminology that other people had used that were part of a broader, more ancient folk before the divisions and migrations of, for example, the Germanic bloodlines into Europe and the Nordic bloodlines. For example, the term Aryan, to me, I see the modern usage as something that's not historically correct for our own people. I think it was a misnomer that began in the 1800s, but historically, our Germanic folk never actually called themselves Aryans until the 18 and 1900s. And I think it was incorrectly applied to our people. Now, I realize that some people today think it's a term that relates to our folk and seek to syncretize our history and traditions with Vedic traditions and histories, because that's where the term originates from, is those Indo-Europeans that had migrated into India and Persia. They use that term to describe themselves. And while we're related to these ancient Aryans, the Germanic people as a whole are not Aryan per se. And the Vedic tradition actually has nothing to do with our Germanic tradition. The term Aryan was first used in the 1600s, and it was a term in classical history from Latin, Arianus, Ariana, from Greek Arya, Arya, and these names applied in classical times to the eastern part of ancient Persia and to its inhabitants there. Ancient Persians used the name in reference to themselves, hence the name of their country today, Iran. Ultimately, the Sanskrit Arya, or compatriots or noble folk, also used the term in their Sanskrit writings in the Vedic texts from 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. The word was first used in the 1800s by the German philologist Friedrich Schlegel in 1819. And he linked the word with the German word Ehre, which means honor. And he applied this to the ancient people whom we now call and identify as Indo-Europeans, because he suspected in his own thoughts that that may have been the name that the ancient folk called themselves. But this use, but the use of this word isn't actually attested in English until about 1850, when it was specifically contrasted to Semitic languages or tongues. Max Mueller, who was also a philologist, he lived in the mid and late 1800s. He popularized the term Aryan in his writings on comparative linguistics, essentially recommending it as the name, replacing Indo-European or Indo-Germanic or Caucasian for the group of related inflected languages that he connected with these peoples, which was mostly found in Europe, but also included the ancient Sanskrit writing and Persian writings in Southwest Asia. I see this as a term that was gradually replaced in our language in the 1800s instead of using the term Indo-European. Now, I wouldn't consider the original Indo-Europeans to be who we are today as a people. We're certainly descendants from them, but we're not them. We're more of the pan-Germanic folk, and we have developed our own unique identities and histories separate and distinct from these other Indo-European or classed Aryan people. I think our own tribal memories makes us different in that regard. What do you guys think?
I mean, just from the basics that I picked up, that the Aryans being, or as defined, being more the Vedic side of the family tree, I do think it's, I don't want to say counterproductive, but, you know, kind of going back to what me and you have talked about on a few other episodes as far as defining ourselves amongst ourselves. I think that might be a thing that we need to start looking at. And then I was also thinking too, that I think another reason we see a lot of division in the names is because everybody's consistently trying to reach back and only looking there. And I think another factor is also looking in the now and, you know, maybe possibly, I don't want to say coming up with a new term, but finding a way to identify ourselves as a whole now, especially in the States.
And before I get your opinion, comment on what you said there, Anthony, and add that, you know, like the term Hyperborean is becoming a very common term nowadays. But this word itself is a Greek word. It doesn't come from the Germanic people. It was a term that was applied to the people that came from the north, which are certainly our ancestors, and it's certainly who is being referred to. But this isn't what we called our own selves. We aren't Greek. We're not Roman. We're not Vedic people. You know, we are our own folk. And that word that we have used in our native tongue to describe ourselves for centuries and even 1,000+ years is essentially tribe. The word Teuton, that means the tribe. And we can see this even in German today, where they call themselves the Dutch. The Dutch. That word Dutch comes from Diot, which comes from the exact same word as Teuton. So that's how we identified ourselves for centuries, if not 1,000, 2,000+ years. We can see this same idea expressed by Tacitus in his writings 2,000 years ago in Germania.
Well, I guess you know, my when I first heard the term, of course, because I was a very big student of World War II, and of course, like, you know, the Nazi regime and everything, they brought it up quite a bit in their racial program. And my personal view is like the Aryan is part of that ancient Vedic people type thing. Like I mean, if we go, I think we might be talking about the Rigsula later, like the three classes of men. And I think I'm learning a lot already, just like listening to you. So I think my take on this Aryan word is that I don't know. Now it's not as clear as it used to be for me, and I'm interested to hear else what you have to say, James.
I think I'm about where Joe's at on this one. No, I mean, I really can't, at this point, I really can't add anything any more than I already have.
Yeah, I mean, if Aryan,
Right.
which I thought was a Germanic tribes, is actually some separate thing. I mean, obviously, it's kind of confusing now. I don't know.
It is confusing, and I think that, as I mentioned, the confusion arose in the mid 1800s when essentially we were trying to find an identity, and I think this is a symptom of what happened over hundreds and 1,000 plus years in Europe with the transition from our native pagan faith to Christianity, where they wiped out so much of our knowledge of our own metaphysics and how it works and how our people saw and believed things, that as the Renaissance in the 1800s began among the German folk, that they began seeking to reestablish that connectivity to the past, to who they came from. And I don't think it's wrong, them seeking that identity and trying to find the definition of who we are as a people. I just think it was incorrectly applied. I think that it's important that in moving forward in today's age, where we've reached a certain stage of understanding the history and what's happened to our people, that instead of using foreign terminologies to describe and define who we are as a people, that we use our own terminologies to define and describe who we are.
I would agree with that.
It's tough because Christianity, that war of Christianity wiped out a large part of our history. So I mean, I've seen lots of parallels between like the Vedic religions and the Germanic religions, and personally have kind of traced like the different gods back to all these different deities from you can go all the way back. And I don't know, I think, well, my opinion is that Christianity is probably the worst thing that's ever happened to mankind, the monotheism. But anyways, so
I would agree with that statement, Joe. And I don't, just for our listeners out there, and I don't think you're aware yet, Joe, but our plans with our shows is we're going to go through this lore. We're going to cover it all. But after the lore, we're going to begin starting to talk about the history of our folk throughout Europe and the transition of how it happened and why it happened over the centuries, really the last couple thousand years. And this is going to be an important component of the mission of what we're doing with our podcast, to educate our people, teach them their true history, their true identity, and stop seeking identities from outside people that are not from us. I would say one thing about, because there's a trend today to try to essentially what's called synchronize or assume that all Indo-Europeans were the same. We weren't. We all have our own unique identity, culture, and history. And we have to realize that we are not the same people as the people that went to Southwest Europe. There was a division that happened many years ago. And you're right, Joe, there is a lot of correlations between the Vedic texts and their religions because we are cousins with them, but we are not them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, obviously, I mean, it's been thousands and thousands of years, so like the population has changed. You know what I mean? But maybe I think those original people who wrote those texts were.
Well, they were certainly, the original people that wrote those texts were certainly from that noble class of whom we also descend from. But there was a division in the history. The gods did interact with different tribes and different folks at different points in the history. So our history and our relationship to the gods is very different than what it was for, let's say, the actual Aryan people that lived 2,500 years ago.
I think the separation of peoples and tribes, just even through distance, like you can create a. I guess you could, if you want to speak metaphysically, you create like an energy for each different group, right? I mean, you look at Rupert Sheldrake and morphic theory, and I think that, yeah, like time and language and everything will create these different pockets of metaphysical relations to each other, and I think that's what's happened over the thousands and thousands of years.
So kind of like on the topic, I think it's super easy to focus on the fact that we all come from the same root and not see how the tree has been divided. Like there's reasons we kind of branched off from the Vedic peoples. There's reasons that the various Germanic or Teutonic tribes kind of branched off among themselves while still being tied, having their own separate identities. And I don't know, like I just feel like it's one of those things that makes reconstructing everything a little bit more nuanced, because we have to find those roots and really understand those roots, but in the same spirit, also seek to define ourselves now.
Exactly. If we put it in modern terms, we can look at it like how different cultures are today. We can speak broadly about like French culture or English culture or American culture or German culture or Norse culture, Swedish culture. But we can further define that by saying, for example, with American culture, there's multiple cultures in America. And for example, the Texans or Southern people, they have their own culture or way of doing things, way of seeing the world. And it may have a very similar, broader world view of the rest of the American people, but is still unique to them. And if we apply this understanding to the past, we can say essentially the same thing, that even though there was a general consensus in the worldview of how the gods interacted with people, they each had their own unique relationships to their areas and regions and gods and such, that it makes them completely different, because a Southern person isn't the same as a person that grew up in New York City.
Yeah, I think in this modern world that we live in, it's I don't know, it's confusing, because I have Nordic ancestry and Slavic ancestry, and like a mixture of like all these different peoples that came from Europe. But I identify with our gods and goddesses of the Norse pantheon. But I think that the Slavic gods are quite the same. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but I'm not sure.
I think you're trying, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're trying to say is that there arises a little bit of confusion with that for some people, where it's like, well, I have a mix of different, Indo-European people in my bloodline. How does this all fit together? And I think that is a valid confusion that people have today, because especially with the way that our religion's been propagated over the last 20, 30 years, where there hasn't been a cohesive worldview that's united people in this. And the way I would reply to that confusion is that the Slavic people, the people of Europe, all interacted with each other. Even though they were separate tribes, they did share a common worldview. They did share the same gods and goddesses. It's like, for example, the Winili or the Longobards and the Saxons, that these are all unique tribes. But anytime that they ran across outside forces trying to essentially interfere or meddle with their folk, they would always unite for the common good. In one of the conversation chats that I have online, another kinsman of mine had brought up, we were having a conversation about this specifically. He had brought up when we talk about, for example, Herman the German and the German folk and how they rose against the Romans, that it united tribes together. So I don't think there needs to be confusion over it. I think that we need to understand that generations of separations have made us a different people from other Indo-Europeans that had no interaction with our folk for thousands of years.
So kind of what you're saying,
Anthony?
Essentially, is not falling into the trap of there, just for the fact that there's different denominations doesn't mean we can't work together, like we see in
Or that
some
we're different people.
religious paths.
Like we see what?
Like we see with other religious traditions where different tribes, different denominations will fight amongst themselves. For us, we need to acknowledge that, but at the same time realize we are still the same. That's kind of what I picked up off of what you were saying.
I know that this is a controversial topic for folk today, especially ones that share the same overall worldview as us. But I think that we have to stop looking to outside sources to make that definition and realize that our ancestors were very strictly tribal, in the sense that probably the lay person identified themselves specifically with their tribe. But I think the overall folk itself still understood that there was a greater or broader tribe or people that made up the collective of our folk.
Yeah, James, I think we are all like different tribes, Germanic tribes and everything, but I think now with this new world we're kind of creating like a new tribe, like a gigantic larger tribe, which I guess overall is the folk, right? And I think thanks to technology and just where we are now with all these of our mixed kind of ancestry, we're creating this just large movement, this a bigger tribe, which is also the reason why, like, instead of maybe, we follow the Norse pantheon because we can all, it's like this big metaphysical ball is already rolling and we're all giving our energy to it instead of like creating different factions of that. So that's why I think that we're using the Norse pantheon.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I mean, going along with that though, I don't think there was much of a difference in pantheon for the broad folk. As I mentioned, their relationships with the gods may have been different, but they all saw the same gods. And I believe, this is another thing too. I constantly hear where people today, they speak about ethnic faith, for example. And certainly our faith is an ethnic faith, but I think that's a really shallow way of looking at our faith, because people tend to fall prey to this materialist idea that it's all about just a surface level identification, instead of the deeper metaphorical and metaphysical levels of our connection to our ancestors that make us who we are, which is our religion, which is the faith that we have. So, for example, there's some people in our faith today that don't actually believe the gods were real. And they would describe people that do believe those things as Christian true, is a term that I've heard used, for example, that these are just people trying to make a religion. This doesn't have anything to do with our religion. But I think when we do that, I think that we actually kind of defame our ancestors. Because if we took our minds out of the modern age and the way that we see the world today, and we actually tried to objectively put ourselves back in the minds of one of our ancestors 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, that they certainly believed that the gods were real. And today, when we deny that or say that's not how it is, that we're actually, in a way, calling our ancestors ignorant people. And it always begs the question in my mind, at least, that when we do that, how can we call this a faith, or how can we call this a religion, when we can't respect what the actual beliefs were, our ancestors truly held thousands of years ago?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I believe they were real people. I mean, the Yinglinga saga, I know it seems to be controversial, but I believe that Odin was a man, and we're actually related to him by blood, right? I mean, you can interact with them now; they exist, and yeah, I agree completely. They walk this earth.
I mean, I personally think, regardless of how you look at the gods, we are a polytheistic faith, and a theistic faith involves belief in the divine. So if you're calling yourself a Asatru, Norse pagan, whatever, and you do not believe the gods are real, you are an atheist. I'm
That's
not pulling
true.
any punches on. I'm not pulling any punches on that one. That whole thought irritates the hell out of me.
You're correct. I think it is a lot for people to. I mean, I was an atheist. I was a Christian until I was 16, and an atheist until I was 48. And then my enlightenment, I guess you could say, where I realized that these other, there's more than this world that we can see. There's just the spiritual dimension. And I think a lot of people have a hard time getting by that, especially after we live in this materialistic world where everything's about money and this and that, and spirituality has really kind of gone to the wayside. And plus, we've been lied to by Christianity, right? It's a big lie. I mean, a lot of people have a hard time grasping the other worlds.
That's a very, very good point, Joe. Now let me get us back on track to the timeline of events and tie this together with what we've been talking about, because I think that's important. We know from the Rigsdula the different lines that Rig had bred, and I believe when we look at this from an objective perspective, that it's easy to conclude that these are different time frames that Rig had injected himself into the folk. And I think that, for example, he claimed Jarl as his own. And I think that there's probably a broader migration of children of Jarl that happened, and that they did spread all over the place. They spread to Southwest Asia, Europe, even parts of Africa. But I think that Konr was the son of Jarls that essentially cut the territory in Europe for our people and our lines of being. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
So you're thinking that these separate classes of people created by Rig are different races of people? Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I personally think that all the classes of Rigs, the Jarls, Karls, and Thralls, are certainly part of the broader Germanic folk. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Jarl had different children himself, and that were, quote unquote, the noble class of folk, and that the European or Germanic branch came through a few lines through him, but one being Konr. Because Konr, in our lore and in our history, he essentially was described as being endowed with outstanding gifts of body and mind. And it's said when he was born that the Nornir came to him and decreed his fate, that he would become one of the most renowned warriors and kings, essentially, of our people. And this fate actually became so true that the word king itself comes from his name. And I think that he established the law throughout the Germanic lands, and that is the tradition that we follow and that was given to us, passed down from Rig and Jarl himself to Konr.
Yeah, I think certain people are born with different abilities. I mean, I've seen it. Like I have my friend, like he just attracts like success and money. Like he's just an indifferent individual. And I've acted in different movies and things where like different actresses, like they're just different beings. They really are. Like they just attract this. They have this energy. So I think that certain people maybe incarnate, like if get into rebirth, that their spirit or whatever is just of a higher quality. I mean, we all have our part to play, I believe, in this world. And yeah.
So when I think about your perspective, I think it also makes sense in far as we went from, small hunter-gatherer groups to, slightly bigger but still smaller agricultural communities. And then we eventually move into nations or, clans, grouping of tribes. And each of those is going to involve a higher level of understanding in quote unquote civilization. And really, once we hit the Bronze Iron Age, where groups really start spanning out and laws really start being made, I think that can very easily be attributed to Jarl having his sons or his children, and those children going out and kind of branching out and making their own civilizations, tribes, whatever you want to call it. So I wouldn't say different races. I would look at it as different phases of our cultural evolution.
I think there's actually just people who are just better. I think there's different classes of people. There really are. Like I said, my friend, he's in charge and he attracts success and he makes all the right moves. And like those, some people are just very good at working with their hands, and some just being the laborers. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you can. I think people have like inherent abilities that comes with them. Well, it's funny, when I was in 7th grade in sociology or whatever, I had to write a report of my perfect civilization. And I had written that there was like these different classes of people and everything else. And it was crazy, and I got the teacher wrote an F on there originally, but then he like gave it an A because it was my perfect civilization. I wish I had that report, but I had written all these different classes, and I didn't know anything about our ancient mythology and things like that. Things like that I kind of look at like, then you can kind of start putting together like your many rebirths of lives and things like that. But I think it's natural for people to let's say work in the fields and they feel fulfilled about that. And there's other people that are just born to like be leaders and make all the right decisions. And that's unfortunately, like, out of the millions and millions of people here in the United States, we can't have. There's one guy out there who could be the leader, but all these politicians and all this nonsense, it ruin it for everybody.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think we went a lot over that in episode 6 on the soul, and how that works and the inherent qualities that different souls acquire. But I don't think that it has anything to do necessarily with the classifications of races. I think the classification of races is a modern invention that we've used. And I definitely think that there's different people, though, that are from different sources that have their own unique histories and belief systems and gods and ancestors. And sometimes it's easy for the modern Germanic that is just awakening. Their blood is just starting to stir with the memories of the past, where it's easy for them to fall prey into identitarianism versus the faith or the understanding of our folk and the mission that we have as a people.
I think we all have our role to play. But I think like when you're born, if you do like an astrological chart of like who you are, it literally is like written by the Norns, like what kind of person you are. And I think we all have our part to play in this this never-ending cosmic battle. And there's an awakening going on. You can see it every day, get the emails from people, and like just watching the news, and it's exciting times to be alive. And
Well, speaking about the awakening, I don't remember the name of the YouTube channel I was watching, but this guy he has nothing to do with heathenism or paganism or that, but he actually did a video about the rise of paganism in the world. And it was really interesting because statistically, Europeans make up the greatest body of pagan people. Statistically, we identified with polytheistic beliefs more than any other people in the world. I'll share the video with you later.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to watch. I know I saw somewhere too. I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but that at least in the United States, paganism in general, and Asatru specifically, is the fastest growing religion in the United States, or the second fastest, and it's only second to Islam. Definitely wish we were first. We were first to that one, but right now I think we got to take what we can get.
What's funny is they're both kind of very militaristic and heroic type things that are growing, right? Because Christianity, this whole be nice to everybody thing is failing, right? It's been a big failure and just murdered millions of people. And like you have these two, our heroic Germanic pagan religion, and then Islam, which is just very militant and very manly. So it's funny to see that those are the two that are growing. Like things are heading up for like a big conflict.
Yeah, I mean they're both very much got warrior aspects in their beliefs, so it'll be interesting to see where this trend leads.
Which is why all the more importance on us learning about our identity and who we are, because essentially, and I know some people out there are going to say, oh, you just out there crying about we was kings or whatever. And it has nothing to do with that. But essentially, our history has been wiped from the collective as far as what we're taught by society and schools and things like that. Who we were before, unfortunately, we were conquered by Christian forces that did, in fact, forcibly convert our people. There's stories about how, like for the example, the Battle of Verdun, when I think it was something like 2,700 Jarls were slaughtered by Charlemagne. And this was during a period where they were actually meeting for a truce. And the Jarls had gathered, they were under the laws of Frith, so no violence could be done. And in the middle of the night, Charlemagne sends his forces in, and they slaughter 2,700 Jarls. Imagine the impact that had on our folk as a whole. I mean, because all the Jarls had gathered to fight against this Christian onslaught throughout Europe. And now all of a sudden overnight, 2,700 were massacred.
Yeah, it's quite treacherous, isn't it? But I think there is an awakening now because of the, everything. It's pretty much anti-European. It seems like that to me if you look at the news, and there is an awakening because like I was an atheist, and all of a sudden I had this calling to our ancient religion. I think our Germanic people are kind of binding together and awakening to fight against this demiurge of degeneracy that we are experiencing, this materialistic nightmare. So I think, again, it's very exciting times to be alive. We may have chosen to come here for this great battle. So,
Well, fate has the plan in hand.
yeah, that brings us where we want to live with fate and don't strive against it, right? We got to find our purpose here, stand up and do the right thing, and be more fulfilled and live a happy existence.
I would just say it's easier to swim with the current than against it.
Elaborate on that there, Anthony.
So for me personally, and so I'm just going to kind of tie into the concept of fate. There are some people that believe everything is predetermined, that we don't really have a choice in the things we do in life. Me personally, I believe to a certain extent in what's the term?
Free will.
Well, free will, but also tied to I want to, for lack of a better term, circumstantial predetermination, in that we're born where we're at, and we have the choice to go with our fate or against it. And if we go against it, everything's just going to be crap. But even in going with our fate, I want to say that there's different outcomes that would that realistically would lead to the same end. So like we can't necessarily change the whole picture, but we can change certain things on the picture to create a better outcome for the next generation. Because we could just go with our fate at the bare minimum and not really change anything but add to it, or we can, take initiative and do our best to, alter things to create a better picture in the end, or we can go against it and start messing up the picture, and then generations down the line have to come back and fix the blemishes that we caused. I don't know if that makes complete sense, but that's the best way I can explain it.
Yeah, I think
that makes applies to the broader concept of our soul being connected and us protecting that soul. And one of the reasons to make sure that we have a ground, a firm connection with the identity of who we are as a people. So as we move forward with our life, we're actually protecting and benefiting the common good of our soul.
Yeah, I know. We all have a fate, but we also have free will. Like, we could choose to not embrace our fate and get distracted by the vices of this world, and get addicted to drugs or alcohol, and you just kind of lose your way, or TV or whatever. And I think when you choose like that's a big choice there. It's like fulfilling your purpose here. Like when I was a child, like I always felt I wanted to be in the military. You know what I mean? I really did, and it ever since I can remember. And then I finally get in the Marines, and then I got kind of distracted with I had a great opportunity to get a good job as a civilian, and I went that route, and I was never quite fulfilled. Made a lot of money and everything else, but it was just something inside was missing, and until like I said, I was 48, and now I'm working with doing the also true thing. It's much more fulfilling, and this is what I passionate about, would like to do. And I think it's very it takes a lot of will to make that choice to fulfill your purpose here in this grand scheme of this role you're supposed to play in this cosmic battle.
This has been The Sacred Stew. I am Anthony. My co-host is James, and our special guest is our good friend Joe. Y'all have a good night.